will chair this session, which is about the climate change mitigation case studies. I am sure that it will be a very interesting one. Case studies are always more rich than academic ones, given that they include also difficulties of the reality. We have another chance. We have only 3 presentations, so if needed, you can have some minutes more. We can start with the first presentation, which is about effects of electric pumps on farm level agricultural production and groundwater use in the West Bengal. The authors are Marie-Charlotte Buisson, Soumya, Balasubramanya, I hope I pronounce it well, and David Stifel. And it will be presented by Marie-Charlotte, who has already shared her screen. Well, the floor is yours, Marie-Charlotte. Marie-Charlotte, you can begin.
Yes, all right. I was just looking for the unmute while I was presenting, sorry. Okay, so, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. So I am Marie-Charlotte Buisson. I work with IMI. IMI, the International Water Management Institute. We are part of the CGIAR. And I'm talking to you from Sri Lanka, Colombo, where I'm based. And what I'm presenting today is a paper on the effect of electric pump on farm level agricultural production and groundwater use in West Bengal. So West Bengal is one of the eastern states of India. And while it was submitted to the conference initially last year, in the meantime, the paper has actually been published. So it's published with the Journal of Development Studies under a different title, but with the same co-author. So yes, that's a work with Soumya, Balasubramanya, and David Stifel. And I will simply start by just giving you the takeaway messages of this work, which I think are at least 3, at least for a purpose today. The first point is that what we are saying is that in an environment where there is inadequate irrigation, and this inadequate access to irrigation is a factor constraining agriculture, then we see that the electrification of irrigation has actually the potential to support agricultural growth. That's the first good news. And the second good news is that it also generates some proper side effect. And we are saying that simply because we see that electric pump owners who are benefiting from cheaper irrigation, cultivating larger areas of monsoon and winterize, they irrigated their plots a larger number of times and for longer duration as compared to the diesel pump owners. That's the first point. The second one is that the monsoon rise yields and value added are higher for those electric pump owners, which is again a good news for income and welfare of the farmers. And the third point is really on this proper side effect, is that the electric pump owners, they tend to sell water to farmers who have smaller land holding as compared to the diesel pump owners. So that's the first key message. The second one, I will explain you the detail of that, but we are seeing that a one-time fixed cost subsidy is an efficient alternative to the energy tariff subsidies, which is again very good news because these energy subsidies are the ones which are applied in most of Indian states, and those are a major cost for the states in terms of financial burden, but also in terms of water resources use. The third takeaway message, which is more related to this session, is also on the role the learning from our work can be in terms of solarization. So what I'm telling here to you with the role of electrification can very well be applied to what would happen and what is already happening with the solarization of irrigation. So there are some important welfare effects which can be also coming from solarization of irrigation. Okay, so with these 3 maybe takeaway messages in mind, now I'll go through really the detail of the case study and the work that we have been doing. So the context, we are in West Bengal, where agricultural growth to really summarize agricultural growth in West Bengal, we very often look at the growth of this boro rice. So boro is the winter rice, which is an irrigated rice. You need irrigation in the dry season to cultivate. And obviously when you cultivate rice, you absolutely need irrigation. And what we have been seeing is some growth in the 2 decades from the 80s to the year 2000, and then from 2000 there is sort of a stagnation of the agricultural growth, and there are different reasons for that to explain what is happening. But we also relate the story of agricultural growth to the story of what's happened to groundwater irrigation and to irrigation. So the 80s, 90s were really the time of the development of private irrigation. That was related to the land reform, that was related to the ability to access to the Green Revolution technologies, for example. But from the year 2000, what several scholars have been noticed is what they call an energy squeeze. So because the energy access became so expensive or simply so constrained, then the agricultural growth has no more driver. And that's one of the reasons where we see this stagnation. Yet at some point, this has been sold enough loudly so that things start to change. In 2007, there have been the metering. So all the electric tube wells, which before the farmers were getting a flat tariff, a unique bill without metering, from that point, they have been metered. So that's the first big change. The second big change happened in 2011, where there is a removal of permits. So before that, all the farmers needed to get a permit to apply for an electric connection. That was a long process with corruption. Yes, a lot of complication around this permit system. So the removal of the permit was expected to again drive again irrigation and electrification. And then from 2012, there is a subsidy which is put in place, which is a capital subsidy on the cost of getting the electric connection. So before that, farmers have to pay everything from the poles to the wire to the transformer if needed, etc., to get their electric connection. And after 2012, there is a fixed cost subsidy. So that's really the picture of the growth and the different steps of what's happened in terms of the different policies to facilitate the access to irrigation and electrified irrigation. And when we look at the number of tube wells which are electrified, we again really see these patterns. So this is the number of tube wells electrified with the yield of the boro rice. And we see this coincidence of the rising number of wells with higher yields. And that's happening in the 80s. And that's obviously happening, I mean, from the graph, we see that happening also after 2011-12. So after this major reform, we see clearly a rise in the number of electric tube wells, which are permanently electrified. So that's clearly of interest for us. And from this graph, that's purely descriptive, but from this graph, it seems that we are also seeing the yields increasing. So that's really what we are interested on, not with this secondary data, but at the farmer level is. So from this observation, our research question were twofold. The first one is electric pump ownership affecting the agricultural outcomes of the pump owners? That's the first question. And then we were also wondering, the electric pumps, do they also benefit to non-pump owners through the water market? And we are interested by this question because we know that in West Bengal, almost every pump owner, diesel or electric, are selling water to their neighbors or at least to the neighborhood plots. So these water markets are there everywhere. So we want to know if there is an indirect effect on the water market. And by looking at this effect on the water market, that's also looking at the proper effect, because obviously the non-pump owners tend to have a lower wealth status than the pump owner. So those were our two questions. Then when we discuss about electric pump, we can define that as something as a composite good. The most important attribute, we think, is really this lower operational cost as compared to a diesel pump. It's we did some calculation. It's about 30% lower operational cost when you use an electric pump instead of a diesel pump. But there are other attributes. The reparation and maintenance costs also tend to be lower. It's less labor intensive for the user. The higher energy efficiency is also higher. And the other thing is that the electric pump has to be permanently fixed. So it's also less work for the farmer, while for the diesel pump, they have to carry the pump to the plot and to install the pump each time they want to use. And they also need to go to buy diesel, etc. So there are, yes, a number of other attributes associated with the pump. But again, what is most important for the farmers, from what we understand, is this lower operational cost. And with that, as I told you, we expect some direct effect on the pump owners in terms of their agricultural choices, cropping intensity, cropping patterns, the crop that they will grow. We expect some effect on the profitability of the farm, yield, value added, and ultimately the welfare income of the farmers. And we expect also some differences in terms of the irrigation practice. So that's at the direct effect for the pump owners, but we also expect to see some effect indirectly on the water buyers. So with the same indicators, but simply an indirect effect for the water buyers. Very briefly, in terms of the literature, we are digging in this literature on the water, energy, food nexus. That's where we are fitting. And what we know from this literature is mostly on the subsidies to electricity. But anyway, we were slightly different from that. But anyway, what we know is that easing the access to energy from agriculture tend to increase the farm value added. That's the work from Barden et al., for example. We know that it will also have an effect on the cultivated area, which is allocated to the water intensive crops. But on the other side, it may also have some effect on the groundwater use. And for that reason, at the end, when we look at this literature, the net effect is quite unknown and can be limited when you consider the social and environmental outcomes together. So that's probably where more work is needed. So we are working with data which were collected in 2013 among a sample of 1,300 farming households from 93 villages. So that's the map of West Bengal where we've been working. We did the survey in 14 safe blocks and 10 semi-critical blocks. I will come back on that. So the safe blocks are blocks where the access to groundwater resources are relatively safe, while they're semi-critical or critical in the other blocks. And while we were doing the survey, we collected information on the 3 main cropping seasons. And we also collected detailed crop economics data on one plot for each household, which was the plot with the easiest access to irrigation, but which is also most of the time the largest plot of the farmer. So I'm moving now to our empirical strategy. We were facing two issues to concern starting to work with this empirical strategy. The first thing is a non-random electrification policy. So I'll tell you that now it's much easier to get access to an electric pump in the safe blocks as compared to the semi-critical or critical blocks. So that's a sort of endogeneity bias at the block level that we were facing because of the non-random relaxation of the permit system and the capital subsidy as well. So what we did here is to use the discontinuity in the way the safe and the semi-critical blocks are defined to select our sample. So if you look at the graph, there were actually 2 main criteria for defining what is a safe and what is a semi-critical block, which is the post-monsoon decline. So if you have a decline of over 20 centimeters per year, then you become a semi-critical block. And if you have a stage of groundwater development, which is above 90%, then you also become a semi-critical block. So what we did is to select our blocks really at those thresholds, so just above and just below the threshold. And in doing so, we have farmers located in blocks with almost similar hydrological condition And yet the permit system become exogenous because it's different above and below the threshold. So that's our first strategy to deal with the non-random electrification policy. The second step is a bit more usual. That's a non-random pump ownership. We expect the electric pump owners to be wealthier, very briefly, to be wealthier than the non-electric pump owners. And this is related also to some unobserved characteristics. So we deal with that with a propensity score matching, and we go with a model of treatment which will explain the pump ownership by the agricultural and wealth and economic wealth, social capital, environmental and technical feasibility for the farms of getting electrified, and the distance to the cutoff indicators. Then that's pretty straightforward. That's a 5 nearest neighbor matching, and with a quite narrow caliper. Then we did the sensitivity analysis with the different method of matching, and we conducted a number of tests: the conditional independence, common support. We did the balancing test. We also ran some regression with robustness, alternative regression econometric method just to test the robustness. And finally, we have also multiple hypothesis testing. Not really going through all of those. If you are interested, you can look at the paper which is in open access. Okay, so I'm moving to the result, which I suppose are more interesting than the econometrics behind that. So first result on the cropping pattern. The first thing that we see is a higher cropping intensity for the electric pump owners. So that means that they are using their land more intensively. It's almost a 70% more for the electric pump owners in terms of cropping intensity. So the cropping intensity is is calculated really as the number of seasons that they are using their plot. So they tend to use their plot more intensively in the year. That's the first point. And then we look at the type of crops that they are cultivating. And we also see that those electric pump owners, they will allocate a higher percentage of their area, of their plots, to monsoon rice, and even more to winter rice. So again, the winter rice is this borrow rice that you absolutely need to irrigate. So that's not very surprising that they tend to give more to allocate more of their land to this crop. But that's still interesting to see that there is also a positive effect on the monsoon rice, which is in theory mostly rain-fed, by not irrigated, but receiving water from the monsoon. And yet there is still an effect also on this monsoon rice, and I'll tell you why this is happening. Then the second indicator outcome we are looking at is yields and value added. So here again, we see that electric pump ownership is associated with higher yields and higher value added. For this winter rice, yes, but also for the monsoon rice. And that's again very interesting. So that's clearly mean that the yields are better for the electric pump owners for this monsoon rice, which again was supposed to be mostly rain-fed. So what is happening here, and we also had some focus group discussion with the farmers to understand what were the drivers behind this quantitative result. With climate change, the rains are more and more unpredictable. So they are starting later, or at the end of the season, they might be missing some rains again. So then the access to cheaper irrigation through electricity means that the farmers will be able to give some supplementary irrigation to their crops. So 1-2 irrigation at the beginning, or 1-2 irrigation at the end of the season. And in terms of quantities, that's not lot. That's really not making a big difference. But we see this difference on the yield, because that's really the key stage of the crop growth, where water is needed, and water is not necessarily available at that time from the rain. So at that time, getting access to irrigation is really the small thing that will make quite a big difference. So that's quite an interesting finding that we were not necessarily expecting. We were expecting the result on the winter rise, but not necessarily on the monsoon rise. Then we are looking at what's happened in terms of irrigation practices. So what we see here is more frequent and longer duration irrigation from the electric pump owners. So in monsoon, electric pump owners, they are conducted almost 5 more irrigation on their rice plots on average. So that's again what I was saying you, some 2 irrigation at the beginning, 2-3 irrigation at the end of the season. And they also irrigate their plots for yes, a larger number of hours as compared to the other farmers. And that's true in monsoon, and that's also true as expected in winter. So in winter, the electric pump owners have almost 8 additional irrigation as compared to the other farmers, and they irrigate for about 46 more hours as compared to the to a group where we club the diesel pump owners and the water buyers together. This being said, when I present this result, I want to be extremely careful and mention that we know nothing about the quantity of water. I mean, from surveys, it's extremely difficult to quantify just the groundwater which is extracted and the quantity of water which is applied to the crop. So getting this result doesn't mean that they are over irrigating. That doesn't mean that they are depleting the aquifer further. That's, I would say, a separate question that we need to look at and that we are looking at. But from this result, we cannot really say anything. Then we are looking at water selling, and that's really this indirect effect. And here what we see is that there is a higher number of buyers and larger areas served for the electric pump owners as compared to the diesel pump owners. So they are serving more buyers in the monsoon and in the winter season, and they're also selling larger areas. But when we do the ratio and when we compare the coefficient on these 2 indicators, we see that actually the electric pump owners are selling water to farmers with smaller landholding. So that's again a very interesting result when we think proper strategy and to whom they are selling water, but also deriving benefits. Okay, so just a very quick summary of the indicators I've been through here and what we learned. We are in this context of massive electrification of the tube well in West Bengal. I think you'll remember this graph with the sharp rising of the number of tube wells, which is driven clearly by the policy. And so in that context, what we see is that electric pump owners does affect agricultural outcomes of the owners with higher cropping intensity, larger share of cultivated area allocated to water intensive crops. Then higher yield, more value added, and that's especially true for monsoon rise, which is clearly an interesting result. And we see also more frequent and longer duration. That's the direct effect. On the indirect effect side, we see that electric pumps also benefit to non-pump owners for the water market. So we did some back to the envelope calculation to understand what does that mean in terms of additional income. So through the value added, so that's a very rough calculation, but still quite interesting. It's actually almost 8,000 rupees per year from the electric pump owners in terms of additional value added as compared to the diesel pump owners. And when it's quite funny is that it's almost equivalent to this 8,000 subsidy which is given by the government when they get the electric pump. So it's like a direct and not a direct, but it's like a transfer from the state to the farmers, which is really recovered in 1 year. And yet we are not even including the income from water selling, for example. So that's quite good rationale and convincing, we think, rationale for subsidizing this cost of the electric connection. That's a one-time subsidy. The cost is not used from the state, but then it will have direct effect for the pump owners, and it will have direct and indirect effect for the buyers. So then I'm moving to the discussion and on what does that mean in terms of climate change mitigation. Since this case study has been put in this session, I just thought it might be interesting to try to enlarge the discussion on climate change. And I want to be very clear that this shift from diesel to electric pump is not a climate change mitigation strategy in this context. Let's be very honest with that. In West Bengal, 93% of the electricity generation is from thermal sources. So the argument about climate change mitigation here doesn't hold, I think. Yet, what is very, very interesting is that the learning that we have here around the electrification can very well be applied to what would happen and what is happening with the solarization of irrigation, because this access to electrification is really lowering the price of irrigation. So if you lower further the price of irrigation from solarization, then you can really expect the same type of outcomes and welfare effect. And that's quite important to have this discussion in the context of India, because there is an incredible increase in the number of solar irrigation pumps in India these days. It has risen from 4,000 units in 2010. Now, I think there are more than that, but in 2020, there were 200,000 solar irrigation pumps. And actually, India is driving the largest agri-solarization program, which is the Kusum program, if you have heard about that, with yes, incredible targets. I mean, their target capacity is 27 gigawatt power. So that's quite an important program. And we are also working on this question of solar irrigation. Obviously, what we not only in India but in general in South Asia agriculture, what we see is that with a near zero marginal cost of operation, there are some obvious welfare effect for the farmers in terms of the profitability, but it's also getting access to irrigation which is more reliable and less labor intensive, which can also be quite important for women farmers, as yes, that's a picture example, but that's really happening. Then
3 minutes, Mary.
Perfect. Okay, then it has some implication in terms of climate change mitigation, which are obvious and which is helping also those countries to meet their NDC commitment in reducing the green gas emission. And then the question is obviously about groundwater. If you give energy for free, what's happened to groundwater pumping? And here we are working on the question on getting the right incentives, and getting the right incentive. What we are working on and what India is also making progress toward is this system of grid connection, where farmers will sell their excess power generating from solar back to the grid, or they will benefit from a net metering, which means that they have the incentive, instead of pumping, to sell the power back to the grid. If you are interested in those questions, we have a project which is a solar project, quite easy name to remember, and we are working on this question in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. So please reach to me or go to our website to have a look to what we are doing. And with that, I'll stop hopefully in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Does anybody has any question, comments for the presentation? Well, the presentation was quite detailed and very clear. Miria, or no? No question? You completed my questions that in the end, but well, it is, however, complex and difficult to foresee what may be the limits of using the groundwater, how to be sure that you do not, with the increasing of the number of pump owners, you go more deeper in the exploitation of the groundwater. This is one way, because this is completely directed also with the climate change. So the precipitations which complete the groundwater. So, well, it is really complex, I think. It is a moment where it is to stop. You can't continue to increase the number of the pump owners with groundwater. You need to find perhaps other solutions. The other comment that I have is the subsidies that you take into account. These subsidies in capital cost are cover the total capital cost, or it is a part of the total capital cost? And how does this cost to the society? How many, what represents these subsidies in the part of the, for the society? So, if I understood well, all this electricity used in electric pumps comes from solar, or it comes also from thermal power plants. So if it comes for thermal power plants, what this means in terms of emissions. And the other thing is that more you use these pumps, more you need also infrastructure. What this infrastructure means in terms of investment to have the possibility to be connected in each part of the fields, very far from, so how this question is taken into account. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. That's definitely very, very interesting to also to hear simply the points which are interest. So yes, well, on the groundwater depletion, yes, absolutely. And that's, I mean, that's why as soon as I would say solar pumps start to become popular, then we also raise the point, whoa, okay, well, good for the farmers, good maybe in terms of emissions, but hey, hold on, what's happened to the groundwater when you have free energy? That's really what's happening. So that's why we started to work with a pilot at the beginning in India on this incentive of selling back to the grid the excess of power. So the pilot worked well, and the government of Gujarat has been quite responsive. So now they are just scaling up a program where they are doing that at a larger scale. So connected the solar pumps back to the grid, so that the farmers have the incentive instead of pumping ready to selling the power. So they are getting income from the discount from the electricity companies. In addition to the agricultural income, and the idea is that the incentive is to sell to the grid and not to pump too much in terms of groundwater, and that's happening in India. There are some pilots in Bangladesh. There are some pilots in Nepal as well. So that's clearly something which is which is on the rise, and there is policy interest in looking at that together with the solarization, which is anyway happening. So that's there. On the subsidy, that's a lump sum subsidy. So whatever is the actual cost, you always have 8,000 rupees and then it will depend. For some of the farmers, as you would say, who are close to the grid, this 8,000 will clearly cover the cost. And for some farmers, it won't cover the cost, and they will still have to add more investment cost at the end. In terms of the cost for the society, well, there is obviously a cost because that's a subsidy, but nothing to do with the type of other subsidies that you see in other states of India. So most states of India, they have electricity tariff subsidy. So forever, that's really, and in some states, farmers even have almost free electricity. So forever, the states are paying the subsidy to the farmers. And here it's a completely different scenario in West Bengal, because the electricity is not subsidized. The diesel costs are almost not subsidized. At least they are not subsidized for the farmers. So this subsidy was really the first time there was sort of a subsidy for the farmers to get access to electrification. So as compared to what's happening in the other states of India, this is a relatively low cost for the society. And yes, we are showing that even with these low costs, we are still seeing a large welfare effect on the farmer. So that's where the net effect is quite interesting. On the emission from thermal, yes. The point is that what we are seeing here, most of these electric pump, yes, said electric pumps, or actually conversion from diesel. So farmers who had a diesel pump, and then they stop using their diesel pump, or then they use this diesel pump really as a backup, and instead they connect it to the grid to have electric pump. I'm not a specialist to do the calculation of what does that mean in terms of emission. My feeling is that it's quite unlikely that this is reducing emission.
It depends on the mix of the electricity. If the thermal is produced more with coal, perhaps they pollute more than you use directly the oil for the pumps.
Yeah, can be. Yes. No, that's why, yes, I don't know. And that's why I don't think we should sell it as a mitigation strategy. That's clearly not. I mean, yes, since they are producing for thermal, that's clearly not. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Now we go to the second presenter, so which is Miria Nakamya. And from India, we go to Uganda with sustainability considerations for ethanol production. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Miria Nakamya. I'm a PhD student at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, Norway. And like you said, my presentation is about sustainability considerations for ethanol production in Uganda. I will give a brief introduction, research objectives, methods and data, discuss the findings, and then end with the conclusion, policy implications, and limitations. Biofuels is a common topic now, but I'll give a brief introduction. Ethanol is a liquid biofuel derived from starch or sugar-based feedstock. And biofuels are generally categorized as first generation, produced from food crops, second generation from dedicated crops, crop residues and food wastes, and third generation from algae. The current technology, however, particularly in developing countries, permits the production of first generation biofuels. And the focus for this presentation is ethanol in anhydrous form, that is ethanol with very limited content of water, and this is used in blends with gasoline. Now, why biofuels or ethanol for Uganda? The truth is, despite the criticism against ethanol, it has been proven and accepted as a low carbon fuel relative to gasoline if land use change is not taken into consideration. Therefore, in a country with over 70% of the population engaged in agriculture, producing this locally and substituting it for gasoline that is imported would mean pursuing a low carbon path to development. Secondly, in the nationally determined contribution towards climate change, Uganda envisioned at least 22% reduction in its emissions by 2030. And among the strategies is the promotion of cleaner fuels. And then thirdly, almost all the vehicles in Uganda run on internal combustion engines powered by fossil fuels. So the possibility of adopting electric vehicles remain a distant dream. And then also the country spends the largest share of its import bill on petroleum products. This was 19% in 2019, and the trend has been like that over the years. When it comes to exports, it's mainly agricultural products with little or no value added. Therefore, substituting some of these products would mean saving foreign exchange. And then also by exploiting the available technology would mean adding value to the agricultural products for an already available market if government commits to enforcing demand. But there are key issues already known about biofuels. will be, by the way, using the term biofuels or ethanol interchangeably, but the focus is ethanol. So biofuels offer opportunities for agriculture diversification, rural development, energy independence, and they are a way to achieving climate change goals. They are also known to impact the economy, society, and the environment positively or negatively. So the question is, can Uganda use the production of ethanol to supplement its policies and achieve sustainable development? That means that the production of ethanol itself should be sustainable. And it should be known that biofuels are related to all the three pillars of sustainability. It has connections with other sectors and with the dynamics at every stage of its supply chain, causing benefits and risks. So, for example, when we look at the socio-economic perspective, biofuels contribute to the creation of employment, particularly in the feedstock sectors, and to some extent in the industry itself. Secondly, the new demand for crops expands markets for agricultural commodities, which is still a big challenge in developing countries. And this enhances household income as it has been established in various studies. Therefore, socio-economic equity can be promoted as societies become economically independent. Then thirdly, by displacing ethanol, a depletable fuel, by displacing ethanol, a replenishable fuel, for gasoline, a depletable fuel would mean prolonging the life of oil reserves. But this can be achieved at the expense of extensive use of scarce resources such as land. And the new demand for crops may also add pressure on food prices, which can affect some section of the society. From the environmental view, during plant growth, the feedstocks capture anthropogenic carbon dioxide from industries, the transport sector, and other emitting activities. Therefore, through carbon sequestration and the displacement of the fossil fuel, ethanol or biofuels can contribute to a low carbon economy. However, the increased demand for land may cause changes in farming practices like the use of tillages, and it can result in the use of increased use of fertilizers, pesticides, and other inputs, and it can also cause land use change, all of which can instead result in increased emissions. Now, among the common methodologies used to investigate the sustainability of biofuels, we have life cycle analysis, and these specifically focus on environmental aspects. Then there are also economic studies focusing on the socio-economic aspects using economic models. But because of the benefits and risks involved, it requires a holistic approach taking into considerations other sectors and the dynamics along the biofuel supply chain. So there is a handful of studies stated there. These have looked at all the three dimensions in country level models as well as global models like the GTAP. But there is a general consensus regardless of the approach that is used. The results are always contextual. They depend on methodological assumptions and also local factors. So, the purpose for this study is to explore the social, economic, and environmental sustainability of ethanol production in Uganda. Specifically, the objectives are to examine the influence of local and foreign capital and the socio-economic impacts of maize, cassava, and sugarcane ethanol. Then to assess the extent to which ethanol will reduce greenhouse gas emissions relative to gasoline in Uganda's context. The novelty is the evaluation of all three sustainability dimensions, considering the implications of local and foreign capital for the socio-economic outcome, and also the emissions in a local context. And then the production here I look at is production for home consumption. This is in contrast in majority of majority of all the studies on Africa, which have mostly looked at large volumes for exports only, because we think this might not be realistic in the short term. So the significance is that the study sheds light on the hotspots along the ethanol supply chain that should not be neglected during the design and implementation of the policies to ensure a sustainable ethanol sector. The data used is the recent social accounting matrix 2016-17 obtained from the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Elasticity parameters and ethanol technical coefficients are obtained from the literature, and the conversion and emission factors from the IPCC documents and the literature. The study applies a recursive dynamic CGE model, and then the ethanol sector is based on maize, cassava, and sugarcane as feedstocks. These are introduced in the SAM because they do not exist. Now, the reason is the country is still at the level of designing policies and also selecting the suitable feedstock. That's why we evaluate all these three. The macro model or the baseline model, here we have, I will talk about the key aspects here, which I chose the nominal exchange rate as the model numeraire, and all the factors of production are fully employed. The baseline is generated based on the current and historical trends. And then these include, of course, the growth in population at 3.2%, and skilled labor is assumed to grow at the same rate, while unskilled labor grows at a slower rate. Total factor productivity at 2.2%. The policy simulation is as a volume of 0.19 billion liters per year, and that is by the year 2030. So meaning that the reference period is 15 years. This is based on gasoline projection of 1.94 billion liters. So this volume is equivalent or is adequate for a 10% blending level by that year. Now we can comfortably use a one-to-one by assumption that for volume, for the blend volumes below 10% or up to 10% can be considered as an oxygenator, such that there is equality in the liter of ethanol and the liter of gasoline. Now, how this is achieved is through gradual and exogenous increase in capital in the ethanol sectors. So producers draw in more factors of production as capital is gradually increased until that volume is realized in 2031. So in this case, consumption or mandated consumption and investment incentives are implied. They are not explicitly modeled. So we also embed the environmental module using a well-to-wheels approach, meaning that it runs from feedstock farming to combustion. Now, from this, the system releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then maybe through combustion and also the process, as we shall see, and then also through land use change. But at the same time, it captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through maybe like biogenic carbon dioxide during plant growth, as well as carbon dioxide credits allocated to the system from the byproducts. Now, the findings, generally, the production of ethanol increases, contributes to economic growth and the household income increases. But we are comparing between using local and foreign capital. It is found that local capital generates more growth in terms of GDP, that is 0.1.3% against 0.11 under foreign capital. However, we see that the negative impact on the affected sectors, because as production takes place, some factors of production are drawn from other sectors. Now we see that when we use local capital, the effect on the affected sectors, the impact on the affected sectors is a little more pronounced, and yes, it is less when we use foreign capital. This is because it is only land that is reallocated, and to a lesser extent, labor, because capital is coming from a foreign source. Now, when we compare the general increase in the price level measured by the CPI, it is higher under local capital than under foreign capital. The foreign exchange rate or the local currency appreciates still lower under foreign capital than under local capital. Now, the issue is here. When we have local capital, profits are repatriated. So they are sent abroad, meaning that the appreciation here is a little lower. Now, when we look at household income, still we see pronounced growth from local capital and pronounced growth from local capital and lower growth when we use the foreign capital. But of course, all this originates from the fact that profits are repatriated, they do not remain within the country. And now, but what is striking is that despite the increase in income that we have seen in the previous slide, when it comes to welfare measured by equivalent variation, we see that households in the lower income quartiles are affected. Now, the thing is, the increase in the CPI was mainly driven by the increase in the food prices. And maize, cassava are used as a staple food in Uganda. So when their prices increase because of the demand for the feedstocks, this directly affects the households. And the households in lower income quartiles spend a large portion of their income on food. That's why we see this. Now, when it comes to the emissions module, we see that sugarcane outperforms maize and the cassava ethanol. And now, by looking at the components, the process emissions here are very high for maize and the cassava. This is because in Uganda, apart from the hydroelectricity, we do not have many alternative energy sources. So we assume that as the sector starts, I think the initial source of energy for steam and electricity in these sectors would be, for maize and cassava, would be fire diesel boilers. And that's why we have the emissions high. These are, however, zero for sugarcane because we assume the use of bagasse electricity and the emissions are negligible. When it comes to emissions from fertilizers, they are zero for cassava because it is rarely, it is uncommon to use fertilizers in cassava. And then we also that they are smaller for maize than for sugarcane. The thing is, I applied this based on the fertilizer application rates currently in Uganda. It's about 3% for maize and a little higher for sugarcane. So we went with that and then tried to look at the other alternative in the sensitivity analysis. Now, the findings is that what we came up, we look at grassland with a carbon stock value of 26 tons of carbon equivalent per hectare. Now here we assume we have two sub scenarios, I can call them like that, where a half of the feedstock is produced on that land and then all the feedstock is produced like the worst scenario case. Now in this case, we see that for sugarcane, if I compare the two, for sugarcane ethanol, I will call it the carbon neutral level, where the emissions are at least equal to the emissions from gasoline. The emissions for gasoline are these in yellow. So it is between 0 years to 5 years. And then for cassava, it is between 10 years to 13 years. For maize, it is between 12 years to 15 years. So what we can see here, that even in the worst case scenarios, ethanol can reduce emissions compared to gasoline. Now we also test with forest land. Forest land, of course, this is a very high carbon stock value. Now, still we do the same thing, a half and full. Now, the payback, sorry, not the payback period, the carbon neutral period or the break-even point is between 11 and 15 years, an indication that such land should be avoided. Now, despite what we have seen, that emissions reduce, all this ethanol does not break even in the reference period. It means that the payback period is beyond 15 years. Emissions continue to fall, and then it means that in the 15 years, we do not arrive at these values without land use change. So within 15 years, the emissions from land use change are not yet offset. The period goes beyond that. Now, by looking at the total emissions, here we assume that emissions from all the other activities are constant. And we use the first case where a half of the feedstock is produced on grassland. So initially, total emissions, which is emissions from ethanol and gasoline, they lie above emissions from gasoline. But time comes, that there is a time is reached when these are equal, and then these start falling faster than emissions from gasoline. And this is depicted here, the percentage change in emissions. And then we see, sorry, here I interchanged the curves. The red here is the total emissions instead. So they decline faster because even the emissions in ethanol are declining. So what we are seeing here is that ethanol can contribute to reducing national house gas emissions anyway. So in summary here, for the economic results, changes in elasticity parameters only cause marginal changes in the results. But when with a little perturbation with the fertilizer parameters, we experience substantial changes in emissions compared to processing and feedstock yield parameters. This is mainly observed in the maize, and this is the crop that has the least yield per acre. And then when we compare processing emissions with the yield, perturbation in this parameter also is more sensitive, but this is consequential because it is significant in the total share because we assumed diesel-fired boilers. But all in all, we see that the parameter yield is key since it is related to the use of fertilizers. Now, the conclusion here is that ethanol contributes to economic growth, as we have seen that GDP increases and household income also increases, but it is better to prioritize local investors, avoid profit repatriation, given that this sector is small, but it has negative impacts on other sectors. Like we saw the appreciation of the exchange rate is mainly because when we substitute gasoline, the imports reduce, and then this affects the current account. This is good for the economy because we save foreign exchange, but it somehow affects the local exports. Now we see that sugarcane is the most suitable in terms of the carbon footprint, and cassava is also a good alternative, but there is need to improve the yield. Then government can also focus on investing in low-emitting energy like bagasse energy, and also the use of forest land should be avoided. The limitations of this study is that it does not extend to other social and environmental aspects like water. And then also, it is also limited. Much as we see that economic growth and household income increases, we are not able to see the distributive impact at the micro level, something that can be done using a micro simulation model. Thank you.
Thank you, Miria. Very good presentation. Does anybody has comments or questions? Well, I have some few questions. My main problem is the question of impact of using the land for energy, the impact on food prices. Do you have any idea how it can impact the food prices? And well, you said a little bit that the fact that you use more land, you use more water, you have a deterioration of soil. So perhaps the arbitrage needs to be done a little bit better, because at the beginning, when you have small quantities, you do not see the impacts, but with more and more quantities, the impacts become really very, very important. Perhaps you have done perhaps already some comparisons with the experience of other countries who has more long experience of producing ethanol to better see what may be the impacts and how to avoid them. Because, well, it is nice to say that we reduce the imports, we create more labor, but, well, it is the moment when each decision must be studied more in detail, not only one criteria, because perhaps the impact may be much more important than what we gain with ethanol. Well, what it's also the impact on the emissions in the graph that you show. I didn't understood why with the years the emissions of maize are lower. What happens? Okay, thank you.
First, I will start with the process. I already explained here the increase in the CPI. It increases between 0.71% to 0.78%. And I also explained that this is mainly driven by the increase in the feedstocks. And these feedstocks are also used as food in Uganda. And it is the thing that is affecting household welfare here. It is declining mostly for the households in lower income quarters because they spend most of their income on food. So despite the increase in income we observe here, they are affected because of the increase in prices. So yes, that problem of increased price is there. Although we are looking at if prices increase, probably this can be a source of market for the agricultural commodities, because in developing countries, we have shallow markets and it's not easy to access international markets because of the standards. But there are things that should be looked at this point. So when we observe such results, it means that the government should take a closer look at such things. And then when it comes to land, I have extended this study to include land, water, and energy. This is something I'm looking at. I will include in my PhD thesis, but this is the first paper I had submitted to the conference, so I had to maintain that. But we see that this can be very good for us in terms of markets. And then the other thing, why one would be positive about it, it is undisputable. The yields in developing countries, and particularly in Uganda, are very low. For example, the acreage, the yield for an hectare, the yield for maize per hectare is 2.2 tons. That is very, very low. But this is something that can be improved. I also showed in the result that we maintained the current rate of fertilizer application, which is only 3% in maize. So if there is an improvement in the yield, like the sensitivity analysis showed, we see that emissions can significantly reduce. And then for the emissions with maize, what I tried to show here, that of all the feedstocks, these emissions are cumulative. They are cumulative in that in the first year when land is cleared, these land use change emissions are extremely high, but these remain constant. They keep on reducing as the volume of ethanol increases. So they reduce and reduce. But of all the three, we see that maize ethanol performs poorly. It reaches the carbon neutral period in later years compared to cassava and sugarcane. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Well, not completely convinced, because for me, the carbon balance, it is more tricky for biomass, because the time when you capture the CO2 and the time when you use the ethanol, they are quite different. And there is also another impact where the efficiency of using ethanol is worse than efficiency of gasoline or diesel. So you can have an impact in the increase of the emissions and pollutants when you will use this ethanol, for example, in the transport. No?
Can you try to make it so clear? Maybe I don't understand what you mean here.
My idea is the carbon balance. There is a gap between the moment when you capture the CO2 by maize or cassava and the moment when you produce the ethanol and you use it. So even that we say that the ethanol emissions are zero, in reality, in the cities, you have some pollution. So this must be taken into account. And the worst is that the efficiency of the cars which use the ethanol is lower than gasoline or diesel. So all this must be taken into account. So not only in global, but also when you use this in the cities. Does this increase the emissions when you use it, if you do not consider it as a zero, in fact?
Anyway, I did not consider that the emissions, if I do not take into account land use change, are zero. They are not zero. Because I assume here that the disaggregation gives us the emissions at every stage. And we take into account the byproducts and also biogenic carbon dioxide. So in this case, I include from mechanization up to tailpipe, only that the tailpipe, I only account for methane and nitrous oxide, because I assume that carbon dioxide from tailpipe is captured through feedstock growth. And then this is what we have along the supply chain if we do not consider land use change. And so we have these kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per liter. So what I did here is that I added the emissions. Okay, if we are producing, this is producing if we are not expanding on new land, this is what we'll have. But if we expand on land, which is grassland, in the initial year, they will increase. And then as production increases, they will keep on dropping. And I explained here, yes, there is a point where there is a neutral, like a carbon neutral point, but much as this happens, this type of ethanol does not pay back the emissions, meaning that within 15 years, we fail to go back to what we only get from the supply chain. Still, the emissions remain higher. And these are factors that government should look at.
We still have 35 minutes, and we have a question also from Charlotte. So,
okay,
if we go,
well, hurry up then.
Okay, I'll be very, very brief. No, I had the same type of question on, and what was very interesting for me is the graph where we see the distributional impact on different type of household. That's really for me what is key on what you presented. No, just the one before, I think number 16. And yes, and I was wondering what is the driver of that? I assume that from what you're saying, it's mainly through the price of food, which is expected to increase. And I was wondering, is there any way, are you doing, or is there any way also to take into account the self-consumption, knowing that self-consumption is quite important, especially for the lower welfare categories of household? Is there any way you can account for that as well in your model?
I haven't included that in the model because the data in the SAM does not account that. So that means going back, maybe it's something I could have stated as a limitation.
Thank you. So we go to the last presentation, Kemal Sarica, who will speak about GHG emissions mitigation potentials in Turkey's waste sector using the bottom-up energy model. The floor is yours. Kemal, we do not hear you. Kemal, you are mute.
Now, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, now.
I think you can see my screen online.
Yes.
So thank you for listening. So we will.
I think he has an
study
internet
is about the
connection
Turkish
problem.
waste sector.
Sorry, what's the problem? Okay, go on.
This study is about the potential mitigation of the waste sector. So we are currently deploying, we are just investigating the possible potentials of the waste sector, especially the solid waste, municipal solid waste collection and deposition. So we will start the brief introduction. We will go through some methodology. We will briefly describe it, what we have done. We will go through the results. First, we will get through the reference case. Then we will get to the investigated mitigation options and their potentials. I will share. Then we will get through the economic assessment of those mitigation pathways. So, as an introduction, why the solid waste management is important. On a global scale, the amount of the emission that is given into the atmosphere is not small. It's roughly 2.1 billion tons on 2016 and expected to reach more than nearly double by 2050. And the volume of the solid waste that is being worked on is around going to be 2.6 billion tons by 2050, which is a huge increase compared to today's numbers of 1.6 billion tons level. So on the total picture, it's a 5% global anthropogenic human-based emissions, which is driven primarily on open dumping and disposal in landfills. most of the time, the landfill gas capture is limited and the recycling is omitted on a global scale. So how did we start to this study? Let's say the solid waste management entities has initiated the project. They are asking for nearly 17.8 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent emissions has been emitted. And since the country is in the path of signing Paris Agreement and getting into the emission trading system, this amount becomes an interesting number for them. So the solid waste disposal is 73.8% of the sector's total emissions, and in total 32.2 million tons of municipal solid waste has been generated. And 2/3 of that waste only reach the sanitary or managed landfills. The others are dumped on the open dump sites. The recycling or the recovery facilities only get 10% roughly of those total waste. So the contribution to the methane and the nitrogen oxide emission is 20 and 15% respectively, which is a significant number in total. So in that respect, the requests are was a lot, okay. They wanted to have the potential and the cost of the possible strategies for the emission mitigation within the sector. In that respect, they asked for a technological representative model. They wanted to see the full chain of waste flow between the portions of the sector. They wanted to see the cost and their cost of their choices directly. They wanted to see the model to run in the perspective of investors and decision makers, potential investors, let's say. They wanted to see the emission accounting based on international level. They wanted to see the impacts of the taxes, subsidies based on commodity and the technology investment level. So on that respect, the assessment will be based on medium to long term, and they wanted to see the current impact of the current infrastructure on the future decisions and how the decisions or the future decisions will, near future decisions will have an impact on the far future. So in that respect, we come up with a bottom-up model. We studied a detailed representation of the current and future technologies as much as we can, the possible...
Sorry, Kemal, do you advance with your presentations because we are always in the outline here?
No, I think it's stuck. Just give me a second. Let's share it again. So is it refreshed now?
Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't realize that. So what we have done is come up with a bottom-up model for a fuel technology-rich infrastructure representation, considering all terminal options of the waste disposal. We come up with a partial equilibrium piecewise linear optimization model that is minimizing the cost of waste process on an sectoral basis, and it has permitted us to be able to implement the current policies as well as the possible alternative policies that may arise in the future. So, I'm sorry. So what we have done is an emission accounting based structure has been developed based on UNFCCC guidelines. Landfill emission modeling has been carried out by using the first order decay. Technology characterization is based on the International Energy Agency, World Bank, and the various technology options that has been investigated from the literature. Policy characterization is based on international experience and the current policies that has been investigated using the official gazette of Turkey. So the structure of the waste that we are getting through is important in that respect. For municipal solid waste, most of them, 55% is bio-waste. The others are coming paper, plastics, metal, wood, and glass, and some small percentage of combustibles, and some household hazardous material. On the packaging side that we have included also does not have that bio-waste, but a higher proportion of the plastics and the paper cardboard within the composition. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but the technologies that we have included, at least a small list of them, you can see on this table. We have investigated material sorting equipment, composting, anaerobic digestion, bio-drying, incineration technologies, gasifications, pyrolysis, and the potential cost of the dump site and central landfills with LFG structure. So within the reference case, the population that we are going to investigate initiates from 78 million that reaches more than 100 million in the planning horizon. As you can see, the population served is a huge, nearly 95 to 99% of the total population in that respect. The amount of collected municipal solid waste increases from 30 million to 44 million in the long run. We have also have high quality material coming from packaging waste that we have also included in the model. So the breakdown of the current structure is 18 million of that 30 million goes to sanitary landfills directly, 9 million goes to open dump sites, and the remaining is passed through the mechanical ordering technologies, so mechanical separation technologies, and this is 1.5 million roughly, and very little biomethanization, composting, and drying is deployed currently, and 1.3 million of recyclables are generated through that collected waste. So for the reference case, given the current policies that has been intact, we are expecting the emission levels rising from 116 million to 170 million by 2050 within the business as usual scenario. The methane emissions will be stabilized within the current policy framework, 465 to then it reaches on to 500 and 680 million tons, not as huge as the CO2 equivalent portions, but most of the time it is not the only CO2 or greenhouse gas that is emitted, but also flaring and gas combustion is also a source of that GHG emissions. And we have also included in that a separate, even though UNFCCC puts them into energy related emissions, we have also included as a primary combustion of the waste sector. So in total of 190 million tons of CO2 emissions is expected within the far future, but in the near future, 150 million ton is expected from that sector. So within this setup, we have analyzed two emission mitigation pathway. The first one is methane utilization, which is roughly, which we are interested in the deployment of biomethanization or anaerobic digestion pathway for energy generation, including LFG. And the other one is mostly recycling, which we are trying to maximize the percentage of the total amount of municipal solid waste that gets into mechanical sorting equipment, and the post-processing takes place after it for generation of aluminum, iron, and other recyclables to be fed into industry. So what did we get in total, including all the mitigation activities that we can have? In the baseline, we expect to reach 45 million tons of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Methane utilization is one of the key possibilities that may drop down to the total sectoral emission lower than the base year emission levels. 15 million tons of emission is reachable by intense investment in the sand fields with LFG and anaerobic digestion utilization. The recycling is not so good. It removes the emission increase from the business as usual case, but it stabilizes the emission levels around 35 million tons, but it is not as effective as the biomethanization mitigation pathway. So as you can see in the right-hand side, the maximum recycling increases the tons of recyclables and the material that we get on the right-hand side, as it should be, but the reflection of that recyclables are very limited on the emission mitigation performance. And another important aspect of those two mitigation pathway is the electricity impact on the electricity production. The methane utilization integrates the waste sector to the electricity generation sector. So we expect to have, if that pathway is chosen, the electricity that is going to be generated from that solid waste is going to reach up to 14 terawatt hours of electricity, which is a significant quantity within the electricity generation mix. As you can see, the recycling have a little or no impact on the electricity generation portion. And it's this graph shows the UNFCCC accounting versus the total emission, waste sector emissions, including combustion, both for methane utilization pathway and the maximum recycling pathway with UNFCCC or with combustion. As you can see, a huge discrepancy between the UNFCCC guidelines and the emissions included originating from the waste sector combustion activities generates a huge impact on the reporting. It is not true for recyclable strategy, but from this figure, we can directly say that the emission mitigation will be mostly seen distributed on the other sectors' reductions in the emissions due to ungenerated electricity most of the time. So these policies will have an impact on the electricity generation emissions due to unproduced electricity, due to the electricity generated from the electricity waste sector, anaerobic digestion. So the avoided emissions are, in that respect, is huge. So the emission mitigated by deploying recycling and methane introduces an opportunity for the midterm to future term. But the costs are important in that respect. This portion gives us the breakdown of the cost. For the baseline, you see the total cost of waste disposal in 2030 is around $1 billion. Yeah. And it on an annual basis. And in the baseline scenario, we expect that it drops down to 980 million tons with the technological and advancement and the policies that is intact. As you can see, methane utilization pathway and recycling pathway reports the additive costs in that respect that you can see in this portion. The additive costs in the near term is around 1/5 of $1 billion, $200 million, and increases by the time, but that total cost is around, will be 200 million in 2030 on an annual basis for recycling and $1 billion in the 2050 for that time frame. And in the methane utilization, that cost, additive cost, is somehow much more in control due to the revenue generated by the electricity generation and the revenue generated from that market operations. At the same time, the operating maintenance costs are increasing within the total cost. The capital cost roughly seems to be the same, but the operating maintenance cost of the equipment that has to be deployed adds significant cost to the investors and their budgets, let's say. And in that respect, with the focus on the emission mitigation, higher levels of emission reduction on top of the less cost that is going to be expected imposes an advantage on the methane or landfill gas deployment and the anaerobic digestion possibilities, let's say. Recycling with very minimal impact on the total emissions and higher costs on the total sector makes a secondary choice for the investors in that respect. So, in short, what we have concluded is the central landfilling with LFG and are very attractive in the reference case due to cost effectiveness. In terms of emission reduction, methane utilization has much more higher potential than the recycling strategy. The average cost of mitigation in maximizing recycling strategy is 1/4 less than the methane utilization strategy. And subsidy on the electricity generated through municipal solid waste has a huge impact on the economic attractiveness of the mitigation, methane utilization mitigation pathway on the investors. For the future work, we are expecting to come up with some scenario development, policy design on how to reach those targets, how to prepare the sector for that transition. And on the next step, we expect to integrate the sectoral model to a total economic model so that we can see the interactions between the other sectors as well. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks very much, Kemal, for tackling this very important issue of management of the wastes. It needs more and more research in this direction, because I have the impression that sometimes we do not take into account all the aspects. But first, does anybody have comments or questions? Nobody? I am a little bit surprised with the conclusion that methanization use is better for GHG emissions than recycling, because I think that when we recycle, we do not pollute. We use it in another way, and when we do the methanization, perhaps it is not sure that what it remains at the end of the processing is quite useful for the agriculture, or because I am afraid that it remains some dangerous things at the end of this process. There are some, it smells, people are not so happy. So, well, do we take into account all the impacts of this comparison? The other question that I have is how you calculate the amount of wastes. When you calculate this, I understood that it is exogenous, it is estimations of the specialists, but does specialists have can take into account what improvements can be done, changing the behavior of people to use less waste, or and make more selection, and so just to have an idea. Well, it's enough. Thank you.
Thank you. First question, we have taken into consideration of the market, the possible uses of the byproducts, as you mentioned. We have included within this study emissions avoided by the deployment of the materials that we have recycled on the figures that I have shown you. Let's give it that way. Yeah, as you can see in this graph, the avoided emissions are already included by secondary usage of the materials that we have generated from recycling. On top of it, we have also included the use of RDF or the compost that is going to be produced by those processes. And we have also included the emission mitigation by the use of those, let's say, byproducts. However, as you mentioned, the quality of the product has a huge impact on the pricing of those secondary materials. We have also, in that respect, let's focus on your first question. So that's what we have covered in the emission numbers that you have seen on this slide. So we have covered everything that we can, let's say. On the second portion, yes, we have, there's a secondary part of this study. In that portion, we have studied the separate collection of the waste so that less emission is generated within the landfill gas or any kind of anaerobic methane production within the supply chain, especially for the metals, plastics, cardboards, and the bio waste, so that we can have a separate supply chain for each one of them. And we have seen that the emission mitigation potential gets higher, as you mentioned, the cost gets lower, and the only barrier that we have seen is the cultural barrier that we are going to face within that structure. And yes, you are right. If we do the things that you mentioned, the costs are smaller, even we can reach negative emissions on a sectoral level.
Well, however, the waste, we must manage them. So I think that we can take into account also the fact that we need to manage the waste. So in any case, it is a positive thing to do. Well, yes. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the session host that permitted us to have a correct meeting. I thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for your good work. And I wish to everybody enjoying the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Professor Mima.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you for all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.